The Flea by Donne. One of the best known poems of the metaphysical age. The age is 17th century. And interestingly, the metaphysical poets lived and wrote for a very short period. In fact, it was Dr. Johnson who in his book called The Lives of Poets used the term metaphysical poets to refer to them. And you know what he said about them? The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show learning was their whole endeavor. Why does he say that? Because this group of poets wrote in a style, a total breakaway from the previous age. And when we think of them, we think of their conceit. And what is a conceit? Not the usual English word, but a conceit means a different kind of a simile. When we think of similes, we compare two like words. But here, their similes were comparing absolutely unrelated, dissimilar words. And therefore, two lovers are compared to a compass. At one end, tied together, at the end, seeking their own distance. The other poets of this age were Vaughan, Crashaw, Marvell, etc. And Cowley, of course. John Donne, 1571 to 1631. Poet, scholar, soldier, member of parliament, and later a cleric in the Church of England. He wrote sonnets, love poems, religious poems, epigrams, songs, elegies, satires, and much more. He also translated Latin sermons into English. His style is very ironic and filled with paradoxes. Lived in poverty. He married secretly because his families, both hers and his, were against the marriage, and they had 12 kids. John Donne was a sharp critic of English society. Interestingly, he wrote a lot of erotic poetry along with religious poetry. Many of his poems were set to music. None of his poems were cliched. Some of his famous poems are A Valediction, Death Be Not Proud, Sun Rising, The Dream, etc. In his later life, he had a lot of financial difficulties. He was ill, and therefore many of his poems in that stage became very, very somber. But John Donne is still a very interesting poet. The Flea was published posthumously in 1633. When we think of the metaphysical poets, here is one poem which is erotic to the core, because the poem deals with love and sex outside the sanctity of marriage. The poem is titled Flea, and remember, I already mentioned that the metaphysical poets loved conceits, and therefore he talks of the flea as probably a friend of lovers. Let me read one verse to you before I go on. Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which now me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said, a sin nor shame nor loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. So there are two things here. One, he's talking to his beloved. He's inviting her to share his bed. And remember, they are not yet married. And the coy maiden, who is worried about society and the rules and norms of religion, is not ready to do that. And so he talks about the flea. And he says, look at the flea. It doesn't care. It comes. It sucked me first and now sucks thee. And in this flea are two bloods mingled be. So it's as if the flea is taking the blood from me and then coming to you and then mingled be. Of course, it's a reference to sexual intercourse, which in the 17th century they believed is actually a mingling of bloods. And then he goes on, "O stay, 3 lives in one flea spare, where we almost nay more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge, and you we are met, and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though yous make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege 3 sins in killing thee." It looks like the lady has decided she wants to kill this flea, but the lover advises her not to do so. Why? He says this is our marriage bed and this is our friend. Remember, he's referring to the bed as marriage bed when they are not yet married. We also know the parents are against this match because he says, though parents grudge. And then he says, if you kill the flea, you're not just killing one. You're killing yourself, you are killing me, and you are killing the flea. And therefore he says, stay, stop, don't do it. 3 lives in one flea spare. Let not to that self-murder added be. It's also suicide. And remember, in Christianity, suicide is a sin. So therefore, it's a sacrilege, it's a sin, and it's 3 murders in one. And then he goes on, "Cruel and sudden hast thou sins, pulp thy nail, purple thy nail in blood of innocence. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphest, and sayest that thou find'st not thyself, nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor, when thou yield'st to me, will waste as this flea's death took life from thee." The poem is sad, is satirical, is with a tone of ridicule, is comical, is philosophical, it's spiritual, all put into one. Remember, in the 17th century, this would not be considered a lewd poem. But maybe today in the 21st century, we might look at it as being lewd. Let me begin talking about the rhyme scheme before I move on to the regular figures of speech. You would notice that this is the be, but each verse ends with a tercet. A tercet is a 3-lined verse. So you have woo, to, do in the first verse, me, be, 3, and so on. Sometimes, my dear friends, it's important to maybe look at the pronunciation a little differently because words change in spelling and meaning as well as in pronunciation. The flea is a metaphor for sex all through the poem. You have, of course, the imagery of the bed of the lovers. You also have alliteration, you have assonance, you have imagery, you have personification, you have enjambment. Oh my God, how many figures of speech. That's what makes it interesting. When you read a poem and you already know some figures of speech, to see, oh, this and this and this. There is also hyperbole. You remember the exaggeration, which we have come across earlier. So the hyperbole is whenever you see love being compared to a flea. An interesting poem, a poem truly representative of metaphysical poetry. Appreciation of poetry comes from reading poetry, reading all kinds of poetry, reading poetry from different ages. And therefore, at the end of this session, I would invite you to read metaphysical poetry. One of my favorites is John Donne's Death Be Not Proud. Maybe you could begin with that and move on to other poems. Happy reading!